Okay, hello all you crazy people out there. My name is Michael, I like wizards and dragons and making games, and welcome to a video on shaders that I've been looking forward to making since pretty much I decided that I was going to make videos on shaders. Today we are going to talk about water. Specifically, we're going to talk about the water effect that you see on the screen right now, where you have a ripple effect being applied to a repeating water texture. I really like this effect. This was one of the first things that I did with a shader that was more complicated than just things like color modification. And I think it looks pretty good, and I think it can be used in a number of places, whether that's water or some other kind of fluid like lava or something, or if you have some other sort of material where you'd want to have a distortion applied, such as something like glass. You can use this in both 2D and 3D, and you don't really have to do anything special to make it work in either. It's pretty much the same. It's quite fun. So usually when I make these videos, there are a few what you might call prerequisites. In other words, other pieces of information that it would do you well to know going into the video so that I don't have to explain everything over and over again. This video is going to be no exception. In fact, there are going to be quite a few of them. Specifically, the videos that I've made in the last few weeks on texture stages, texture repeating, and texture filtering are going to come in handy here, as well as just a general understanding of the general anatomy of a shader. Vector 2s, uniforms, colors, that sort of thing. I don't quite want to say you should just go... Wow, it's windy outside. I don't quite want to say that you should just go through the entire shader playlist that I've been doing over the course of 2020, although it probably wouldn't hurt. In this particular video, and quite a lot of them going forward, we are going to be making use of a lot of the different tools that you've hopefully been collecting in your shader toolbox arsenal to make these things work. There is also going to be one more thing that you're probably going to want to look at, and this is going to be a bit different for me. But about a year ago, this guy called Michael Jasper Ashworth made a video on how scrolling textures gave Super Mario Galaxy 2 its charm. I'm not going to watch this video in my actual YouTube video today because that would probably be a little bit weird, but I will have a link to this in my video description as well as one of those pop-out card things. This video is what gave me the idea to do this in the first place. It doesn't talk about any specific shader code or shaders in general or code in general or GameMaker or anything like that, but it does give a high-level overview of what this effect is and what a displacement map does. And in particular, he does a really good job visualizing exactly what a displacement map does, using a couple different animations throughout the video. And instead of just rehashing all of that, I am just going to say, go watch this guy's video because it is really well made and definitely worth a watch. A lot of you may have seen it already. As you can see, it's got 800,000 views as of my recording this, and by the time you're seeing it, it'll probably have even more. This video definitely circulated around a number of game dev communities that I participate in over the last year or so. In the case that you have not seen this video before, or if you just want to watch it again, pause this one. Go do that. There will be a link in the description. It's definitely worth a watch. If you're interested in other things like this, by the way, he's done several other videos on other technical aspects of Nintendo games in the last year. And if you're interested in this sort of thing, you're probably going to be interested in some of these other things as well. In particular, I'm probably going to be plugging his next video in next week's video as well, when I finally talk about cell shading. Anyway.
Hey.
Let's get started. So I have a couple textures here. This is a repeating water sprite. This came from Mario Kart Double Dash, which I believe is one of the examples that he draws from in the video. If you want to zoom in on this a little bit, it's not too special. It's just water. It will tile to infinity. I can't remember if this is the exact water tile that he uses as the example, or if it's a different one. But regardless, this is going to get the job done. There are also going to be a few just cloudy noise sprites that I have. This is going to be the actual displacement texture. This one here is also from Mario Kart Double Dash, if I recall, if I organize my files correctly. Although it should work with pretty much any noise texture that you generate. These two I just made in Photoshop. I just generated in Photoshop, or I should say this one, because I think this is actually this is the same noise texture. Anyway, I am going to drag both of these into GameMaker. In each of them, I'm going to open up the sprite properties and click separate texture page so that they don't get combined with other sprites in the GameMaker texture. That's all I'm going to do for now. In Object 1, in the creatively named Object 1, I am going to, for now, just say draw sprite SPR water blue subimage 0. X can be X. The position can be X, Y. my position in the room. Let's move that over here a little bit. This is going to be pretty small, so I think I'll scale it up a little bit as well. That's not too bad. I will scale it up all the same using Draw Sprite Extended, and we'll specify 2 for the scale. No rotation, no color blending, and now we're just going to see a big water sprite. Okay, that's fine. It's not anything special, but it's at least drawing. So now the fun begins. I'm going to create a shader, and shaders, we're going to call it just shader water or something. And I'm going to set that at the beginning of this draw event, shader set with the water shader, and shader reset at the end. Right now, I just created this. This is just going to be a default GLSLES pass-through shader, both vertex and fragment. We are not going to be touching the fragment shader today, the vertex shader today, sorry. We are going to be touching the fragment shader. If you want, you can get rid of all the garbage the GameMaker generates for you. If you're intending to use this in 3D, you may or may not need the normal attribute in the shader. Otherwise, that's fine. We're just going to be looking at the fragment shader. And anyway, we can run the game again, and this is going to look exactly as it did before. As I said, this is just a pass-through fragment shader. It just takes the sprite texture and the color blending and just puts each pixel on the screen as is without doing any funny modifications to it. Next, let's close the game. We are going to introduce the displacement texture into the shader. This is going to be what texture stages are for. First, let's define a uniform in the fragment shader, and we're going to call that uniform sampler 2D. Did I spell that wrong? Shouldn't that be highlighted orange? Sampler 2D. Displacement map. Oh, okay, it's a capital D. Sampler 2D instead of lowercase 2D. Okay, crisis averted. And we are going to get a reference to that uniform saying, let's call it displacement sampler is going to equal shader get sampler index, and that shader is going to be shader water, and the uniform name is going to be displacement map. And we can actually put the displacement texture inside the shader using shader. Sorry, I always get this wrong. Texture set stage. I really wish texture set stage was instead named something like shader set sampler or something like that, just so that it looks like all of the other shader uniform functions. But never mind. Texture set stage. The sampler ID is going to be the one that we just created. And the texture ID is going to be sprite get texture SPR water displace and subimage 0. We've seen this all before. This is pretty much what we were doing in the texture stages video. This effect isn't impossibly complex. It's not like we're going to be using like differential calculus or anything in the shader. But we are going to make use of a lot of different tools that we have access to when it comes to shaders, such as samplers and such as other things. So just to see that this is working, first, instead of drawing the color from the GameMaker base texture in the fragment shader, we can, instead, if we want to just see that something's happening, look up the color value on the displacement map instead and put that on the screen. And this is going to just draw the noise texture on the screen instead of the water. And that's fine. That just tells us that we have not made any mistakes and that the texture is being used by the shader properly. This isn't actually what we want to do. We want to instead of actually drawing with the displacement map, we want to use it to modify the original. So if you recall from the Super Mario Galaxy video, what the displacement texture does is it will distort pixels in a certain direction based on how dark or light it is. The brightness of a color can essentially be thought of as the sum of its red, green, and blue color channels. So if I were to, let's say vec for displacement color is going to equal texture 2D. So if we're going to grab the color out of the displacement map and save it to a vector 4 color, and I'm actually just going to call this displace because I don't want to spell that entire variable name out every time. So if we were to get the brightness of this color, BRIGHT, brightness is going to equal the sum of the red, green, and blue color channels divided by 3. In reality, since this is a grayscale image that's just black and white, the red, green, and blue colors in each of these pixels are going to be the same, because in computer color theory, grays, shades of gray are what you get when the red, green, and blue values are all the same in a color. Anyway, what that means is if you want, the brightness can really just be displacement.red or displacement.green or displacement.blue. There are other more refined ways of obtaining a brightness value from a color. You probably noticed at some point that, for example, yellows are usually perceived to be more bright than something like a blue color would be, even if the result of the red plus green plus blue average is the same. I am not going to get into that right now. I'm just going to make things easy by saying brightness is going to be equal to the sum of the color channels taking the average. So what we need to do next is use this to offset the texture coordinates that we're going to be using. For now, for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to say that a bright pixel on the displacement map will distort the texture coordinate in the right direction, and a dark value on the displacement map is going to distort the texture coordinate in the to the left, in the negative direction. To make this math slightly easier, since brightness here is going to range between 0 and 1, instead I'm going to want brightness to range between negative 0.5 and positive 0.5, and that way all we have to do is essentially add the brightness value to the horizontal texture coordinate, and a dark value of negative 0.5 will move it to the left, to the left, I know my directions, and a positive brightness value of a positive 0.5 will move it to the right. So to do that, all I'm going to do is take the result of this and subtract 0.5. If you think of a number line, all I'm doing here is taking this range of values and moving it half of a unit to the negatives, in the direction of the negatives. So brightness is a float, and v_v text chord is a vector 2, and you can't just add a float and a vector 2. So what you're going to need to do is turn this into a vector 2 somehow. You can go about this however you really want. I'm going to just define a vector 2, call it offset, and construct a vector 2 out of, as I said, brightness on the horizontal component and just 0 on the vertical component. Now this is a vector 2, and we can add this to the v_v text chord varying without issue, without upsetting the compiler. So now if I were to run the game, you would see a little bit of distortion. Maybe calling it a little bit of distortion is underselling it a little bit. You're going to see a lot of distortion. This honestly doesn't look very good, and that's because we are not actually done yet. So, I mentioned texture filtering and texture repeating at the beginning of this video, and it's, I'm not going to go about doing texture repeating yet, but I am going to turn on texture filtering. So if I were to say GPU set text filter and set that to true, what we saw before, if I were to run this again, what we saw before is a very pixely mess of colors textures being scaled up. Especially since I'm drawing this at 2 times scale. The fact that I'm drawing this sprite scaled up to make it easier to see doesn't really help with the blockiness, but even if I wasn't doing that, you would see that this would look very strange on account of the fact that the displacement texture and the water texture are actually not the same size. The displacement texture is just a 64 by 64 kind of field of noise, and the water texture is 4 times bigger in both directions, 256 by 256. So the pixel density is not the same. So if we want to smooth this out, and this is what I was thinking of in particular in last week's video when I said sometimes you do want texture filtering to be on for sprites that are drawn scaled, for other graphics that are drawn scaled to be fuzzed a little bit. And this is going to make it look actually much more smooth. And you no longer have the blockiness going on. And it looks somewhat like water. There's definitely a distortion going on. It's a little bit strong. Honestly, if anything else, it looks like you kind of just like poured milk into a cup of coffee or hot chocolate or something, and then like dropped a rock into it, and cause it to ripple all over the place. This is because of the amount of the offset that is being applied to the texture coordinates. If you're thinking in terms of texture coordinates, you might realize that the brightness value of 0.5 to negative 0.5, or the other way around, or whatever. That's a pretty big range, considering that texture coordinates generally only range from 0 to 1 in the first place, so a distortion of 0.5 in either direction is going to smudge the pixels literally halfway across the sprite. That's a little bit extreme. So we can get around that by reducing this value somehow. You can divide pretty much any of these values by 2, and since all of this is like multiplication that's a scalar, the result will be the same. You can take brightness and divide this by, like, let's say 4 if you want, and that will drastically reduce the smudging. You can see there's now a little bit of distortion, but it's much less than it was. If you don't want to do it there, you could divide the brightness value here by something. It could be 4, it could be 5, it could be 2, it could be 10 or something if you want a really light distortion effect. I think I'm going to stick with 4 for now. This will cause the result to look the same since the same numbers are going into the equation. You could divide the entire vector 4 by 4 since vectors can be multiplied by a scalar, or divided by a scalar since division is actually just multiplication, and it'll produce the same result. You are probably all familiar with things like the distributive property of mathematics and other such elementary school math if you have taken an interest in graphics programming. What you also might do is you also might want to make this a uniform variable so you can control the amount of distortion with a uniform value. I'm not going to go and do that right now, but just to give you some ideas of how you might want to tackle this problem. So this looks okay. However, it is still a still image. It looks like someone just took a picture of water while it was rippling and it's not moving or anything, and games kind of are an interactive medium, and you probably want to see this change over time. This is where a time variable comes in, and part of me just wants to like put this down for 20 minutes and wait for the wind to die down, because this is like ridiculous. Over the years, the winds in my town has gotten stronger, and I'm not saying correlation implies causation, but they've also been clear-cutting large swaths of trees to make room for building stuff, and when you remove a lot of tall trees that would do things such as muffle and block the wind, it doesn't entirely surprise me that it sounds like there's a tornado going on outside constantly. Don't clear-cut the forests, guys. It makes it harder for me to record these videos. So a time parameter. Time parameters are something that I've talked about in shaders before. They tend to be pretty common because they are what allows you to have a shader effect essentially animate over time. We are going to define a uniform. It's going to be a floating point value, and the name is just going to be time. And if I were to scroll up and actually do something with that uniform, we can say var time uniform is going to equal shader get uniform. The shader in question is going to be the water shader, and the uniform name is going to be time. And then we can say, quite simply, shader set uniform float, and that is going to be the time uniform. And the value is going to be, I'm just going to say it's going to be the number of seconds since the game has started, which can be obtained in a couple ways. My favorite being current time divided by 1,000. I use this a lot in these videos when I need to pass a time-based uniform to a shader. For those who don't know, current time is the number of milliseconds since the game has started, 1 millisecond being 1/1000th of a second. So if you want to get the number of seconds since the game has started, just divide that by 1,000 and you're good. So we're going to make this do something in the shader. For the time being, I'm going to take the displacement map out of the equation, and I'm going to put the time uniform into the equation. So we're going to say vec2 offset is going to equal, and we can just have the texture scroll as time passes. So we can, instead of composing a vector 2 based on brightness, we can just compose a vector 2 based on time. So as time passes, the offset is going to get more and more positive, which is going to cause the texture coordinates to get more and more positive, which is going to cause the texture to appear to scroll to the left. So let's run the game now. And we have the texture scrolling properly for about 1 second. And this is where texture repetition comes in. So if you watch the video I made on texture repetition, you will know what happens when you try to, by default in GameMaker, assign a texture coordinate outside the range of 0 and 1, which is that value just gets clamped to 0 and 1, to the range of 0 and 1, and you don't get any texture repeating effect. So we're going to turn that on right now because we generally want that when we try to make repeating textures. So I can say shader, nope, not a shader function. pay attention. I can say GPU set text repeat, set that to true, and now we are going to have the the texture scrolling to the left and to the up directions. Did I not set the vertical component of this offset uniform to 0? I guess I didn't. I just made them if you only pass one floating point value to a vector constructor, it will accept that value perfectly fine. The compiler won't complain or anything. It will just set the value to all of the components of the vector. So if you create a vector 2 and give it a single variable, it's just going to be vector2.x is going to be the value, and vector2.y is going to be the value. If you do it for vector 4 or vector 3, it'll happen as well. If we only want this to scroll in one direction, you can specify as 0, but that's good enough for us. So now that we can see the time uniform affecting the output of the shader, we can start to use this in a little bit more creative ways. I am going to go back to the original offset value, which is the one that is derived from the brightness of the pixel, and now, instead of scrolling the base texture, I am going to scroll the displacement texture. This is going to cause the displacement texture to appear to move on top of the base texture as time passes, as opposed to the base texture moving. Instead, the base texture is going to stay in the same place.
Hey.
So we can do what we did before. I'm going to create a vector 2, and I'm going to call this time. Time offset is fine. And we're going to construct a vector 2, and let's pass it time on the horizontal. And because I only actually wanted to see it moving on one axis instead of both, we can give it a 0 on the vertical. And then, just as we did before in the texture 2D function down here, we can go and add the time offset to the texture coordinate as it is looked up in the displacement map. And if I were to run the game now, we are going to see that this is moving. The displacement texture is moving specifically. If you look closely at the lighter parts of the water texture, it's effectively the ripples that are part of the sprite itself, you can see that they stay in the same place overall, even though they are being distorted by the moving displacement texture. Again, this is kind of extreme. This ripple is a little bit fast in my opinion, so if you wanted to tone it down, you could either reduce the time value in some way or another, or you could reduce the offset. And reducing the offset will make time appear to pass more slowly, and the ripple is going to be much more gentle now. The displacement is still a little bit extreme. I might think about reducing this even more. That's an artistic choice, though. That's really up to you. Anyway, that is the basis of this effect. You can modify this a lot. You can customize this a lot by playing with the exact numbers. You can have the displacement texture scroll at different rates and on different axes, so you can have it going mostly in the up direction, but also, for example, let's say you could have it scrolling down a little bit at a reduced rate. You can play with these values, whatever looks good to you. That's really the whole point of shaders, is giving you more control over how things end up on the screen. It is a programmable graphics pipeline after all. Okay, I'm going to stop now, but I will be revisiting this effect in probably a few weeks. There are some other 3D specific things that I want to do with water in the future. Until then, the next video that I make will be on cell shading. That is one of the more commonly requested things for me to talk about, due, I'm sure, in no small part to games like Wind Waker and Breath of the Wild. It actually uses a lot of the same tools that this effect does, at least the basic cell shading effect does. So now that I've talked about things like texture stages, things like toon shading, cell shading, whatever you want to call it, shouldn't be that far out there. Anyway, I have a Patreon, so if you want to contribute towards these videos being made, there are links to those in all the usual places. Otherwise, I try to post about 2 of these videos a week. One of these, one Let's Make a Tower Defense game, although that might be going on hiatus, because I'm going to be away from the computer for some amount of time, in a week or so. At least I'm going to be away from computers that have GameMaker installed on them, so I won't be able to record stuff. Anyway, the code for this can be found via GitHub repository in the video description. I hope you found that useful, and I will see you all later. Special thanks to Edward Holt, Indie Punch, Jason, and Zenith for supporting these videos. If you want your name in the credits or to hear yourself shouted out at the end, head over to the Patreon page in the video description to join the fun.